Hi, it's Jake Klein here. Great to be over from Sydney with Tim on Finding the Front, Euroz Hartley's podcast.
Welcome to Euroz Hartley's Finding the Front, where we get to know the people who front some of Western Australia's leading companies, providing you with real insights into the way they think and approach things, both in business and in life. So get the volume adjusted in your car or your headphones sorted and settle in for a great story. Here's your host, Tim Banfield.
Hey everyone, and welcome to another jam-packed episode of Euroz Hartley's Finding the Front. Thanks for joining us. Most of our regular listeners would be aware of Euroz Hartley's, the proudly Western Australian company we are, and the wide range of financial services we provide. This includes private wealth, institutional sales, corporate finance, and targeted research. For the leaders of small to mid-size ASX-listed companies in WA who are tuning in, Euroz Hartley's prides itself on having a leading, full-service corporate finance team that specialises in equity capital markets, mergers and acquisitions, and strategic advisory. The team is committed to assisting companies throughout their business life cycle. So if you'd like to learn more about this team and the services they can provide you, please don't hesitate to contact us or visit our website at www.eurozhartleys.com. Our special guest for this brand new episode is Jake Klein, the Executive Chair of Powerhouse gold mining company Evolution Mining, stock code EVN. If you love mining and gold, then this ep is a must. In the lead up to Jake transitioning to non-executive chair after some 15 years building the company to be the success story it is today, Jake opens up and provides his deep insights and looks back into his accumulated career experiences from growing up in Cape Town to arriving in Australia with $1,000 to the influence of Macquarie Bank on his career to building gold mines and developing China that at the time was opening up and taking Sino Gold to an ASX 100 company that became the largest foreign gold miner in China. Sino Gold was ultimately bought by the Rawdon Group in late 2009 for $2.2 billion. The conversation then progresses to starting Evolution and his detailed views on building the company, gold assets, mining, costs, generating cash and achieving value. And the people and the importance of feeling a part of something great. Jake also takes the time out to explain his insights into Lynas Rare Earths, a company he was non-executive director of for some 12 and a half years, including where it began and where it is now. We then round out with Jake's views on the current China and the challenging position the Australian mining industry finds itself in today. What are the options and how we can remain ahead of the pack, future-proof and grow to be the true global leader we can be. Jake loves the mining industry and loves the people in it, and this conversation is one that, without a doubt, is seriously captivating. So without further ado, it gives me a huge pleasure to introduce to Euroz Hartley's Finding the Front, the Executive Chair of Evolution Mining and all-round great guy, Jake Klein. Jake, thank you so much for taking time out to join us on Euroz Hartley's Finding the Front. You've just flown in from Sydney, literally, and you've managed to squeeze us into your very busy schedule. So thanks very much, Jake. Really great.
Thanks, Tim. Great to be here.
Good on you. Look, it goes without saying, but you're a 30-year veteran of the mining industry. You've achieved so much, and I know you love mining, you love the people in it, and you love the industry as a whole. And I think that's a great place to start because it's provided you with a lot of opportunities over your career. But we'll get into more of that shortly. One of the purposes of this podcast is just to learn a little bit about your background. And I know when I was doing my research that you were born and raised in Cape Town in South Africa, which would have been a fantastic upbringing, I would have thought.
I was. At that time, it was great. Unfortunately, it was in a system during the time of apartheid, which was obviously a very prejudiced system and kind of led us to leave. But it was an amazing place to grow up. I don't know whether you've been to Indaba.
No, I haven't.
Cape Town is an amazing place, beautiful beaches, cold water, and I happened to go to school that overlooked the beach.
Was that Jeffreys Bay?
No, it's not. Jeffreys Bay is a little further up the coast.
Right.
Warm water, good surf.
Yeah.
This was Atlantic Ocean, Camps Bay High School. You could literally look over the fence and see who was not at school.
Is that right?
During the break.
Did you enjoy school?
Yeah, I did. I did enjoy it. It was good. It was a pretty good school. It was a government school. At that time, it had amazing teachers. And I'd say that's the one thing I've reflected on about my kids' schooling is they don't seem to have been motivated or inspired by teachers. But I can genuinely remember the maths teacher, the history teacher, and they had a big impression on my life.
Yeah, yeah. At the same time, your mum and dad were working. How big was your family?
So I've got 3 siblings.
Right.
Two of my 2 sisters are in Sydney. My brother is in Miami at the moment.
Right.
He went off to the US. My older sister came to Australia, and my younger sister and I followed. My parents, my dad was an architect. He passed away about 13 years ago, but definitely not a miner.
No.
And, very creative, very good values, and just a genuinely decent person.
Yes.
My mum was a school teacher. She taught me some Latin, which I think, along with Afrikaans, is probably 2 of the least spoken languages in the history of the world.
Right.
Well, not the history of the world, currently.
Currently.
Very well spoken a lot in the past. She's unfortunately got Alzheimer's disease at the moment and advanced, and it's a terrible, terrible disease, but she's in Sydney.
So you're all out of Cape Town now, obviously. You still got relatives back there?
Not many. Remember, I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and I'd have to say at that time there was very little chance of South Africa turning out as it did in terms of integrating the Rainbow Nation. Was an outcome that certainly my parents and us as kids didn't really anticipate. It looked like the country was headed to civil war.
Right, yeah. Just tell us a little bit about that, the flow-on effect of that situation on your outlook.
It did have quite a profound impact. Just to give you again some context, my grandparents came out of Eastern Europe just before World War II. A lot of their family was killed in the Holocaust. We had Jewish heritage. So my parents were born in South Africa. All of us kids were born in South Africa, but certainly my parents were against apartheid and against prejudice.
Yes.
And we'd always kind of grown up as kids thinking that we were unlikely to stay in South Africa, given the outlook, given the fact that young men had to serve national service.
Yeah.
And so neither my brother or I really wanted to do that, and my parents encouraged us to leave.
So when you look at that leaving, what age was your brother when he decided to take off?
So he is an electrical engineer, and he took off at 22. He effectively landed in New York as an illegal migrant, I think.
Yeah.
Managed to get in, found a job, went to Columbia University and had an amazingly successful career as an investment banker.
And what age were you when you left?
I was 25 because I did 4 years at university. Then you could do 3 years of articles, which I did at PwC. You had to do that to qualify as an accountant.
Yes.
You could defer your military service until then. And then my girlfriend at the time and I went backpacking around the world, and we ended up in Australia about 9 months later. We'd try to get a job in London. She has brothers in London. All South African accountants used to go to London, earn some money to fund their backpacking.
Their holiday.
I was laughed at when I said I'm here for a job. I didn't have a visa, and there was no ways you could get a job. So we ended up in Australia living with my sister and brother-in-law who were living here at the time. We had $1,000 and we stayed in their back room for a while.
Great. Just coming back to school, did you went on and clearly did university, but Did you have any idea at that point on what you wanted to do with your life?
The pathway into business in South Africa was generally through a commerce degree.
Yes.
So I did want to get into business. If you'd given me a list of 20 things, maybe 50, and said list out the likely careers you're going to end up in, mining would have not made the top 50, and nor would mining in China.
Well, we've got a story to tell here. So that is quite interesting that you went around, backpacking with your girlfriend at the time, landed in Sydney, 1991. Landing in Sydney was a pivotal point in your life. You had to go out and get a job at that point with a commerce degree or a qualified an accountant, and you managed to land one at one of the premier institutions in Australia at the time.
Well, I had no idea who I was applying for the job for. I just wanted a job. I wanted to get into banking. Remember there was, all those great books and stories about banking and Wall Street, happening then, Barbarians at the Gates. It was a book I read, I think, on my travels during the time. Liar's Poker. Banking was something I was really interested in. So when someone said, do you want a job or an interview at Macquarie Bank, I had no idea who they were. I thought, yeah, that sounds good. I went for an interview. Somehow I got through the gate. Remember, Macquarie was only 1,500 people at the time. It was really, it was described when they put out their results last week as an upstart 30 years ago. And it really did define a lot of my thinking in business.
Yes.
I was incredibly fortunate to join what has been one of the great success stories of Australian corporates over the last 30 years. And Macquarie today is a brand that sits alongside Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, and any other global institution. So it was serendipity. It was an unbelievably fortunate event. I think it was a newspaper ad in the Fin Review on Friday morning that I applied to, got the interview. This was October 91, really quite concerned because everyone had said, Australia closes down in December.
Yes.
I think I started on the 1st of December, 91.
Who was involved with Macquarie Bank at that point? The names?
So Tony Berg was the CEO.
Right.
Alan Moss was, I think, the head of financial markets at the time.
Yes.
He went on to become the CEO.
Yeah.
Simon Wood, who now runs the commodities division, was a foreign exchange trader. Campbell Johnson, who's an investment banker at Macquarie now, and he's done some transactions for us. He is in credit. There are a whole raft of people who've gone on to be phenomenally successful.
Amazing network.
The stock price, and Macquarie always made employees owners. I started off genuinely as a junior in the division. Stock price was $3.50. It's now $2.20. So what a story.
What a story. It is seriously a success story. The other part of that move to Sydney was your girlfriend at the time ended up becoming your wife, and you've been together now for 34 years.
Yeah, there's something that isn't often told is that she didn't have a visa when she landed in Sydney.
Right.
So we did go to a lawyer and we said, well, what's the best way for my wife, Debbie, to get into the country? And she said, well, do you like each other? And we kind of looked at each other and we said, yeah, kind of. And the next week we're down at the registry getting married. And we have been together for 34 years, and we are very happy, and we have 2 amazing kids.
What a story. The link into Macquarie Bank, the time there was pivotal. And tell us a little bit about how Macquarie Bank shaped your career in terms of where you went from there, because you started out in internal audit.
So I think there are a few things that I'd say really defined my thinking that I learned at Macquarie. The one was Macquarie always believed in having a sustainable competitive advantage. What is the reason you're in that business? So each of their divisions in each of their areas really had a core competitive advantage. At that time, deregulation was happening in Australia. So it was foreign exchange, it was selling derivative hedges on gold, on anything I could sell, options, equities. Remember, I think Excel, it was Lotus that was there at the time.
Yes.
Excel wasn't even there. So you went to a gold producer. Interest rates in Australia were 14%. Macquarie found this incredible way of going to the Reserve Bank of Australia and saying, we'll pay you 1% to borrow your gold. Interest rates are 14%. The contango's therefore 13%. And you told a gold producer that you could pay them maybe 6% more than the gold price is today in a year's time, and they love that.
Yeah.
And you're making 7%. It was bullion was the most profitable division in that bank. And then what to me is amazing about Macquarie is they've pivoted several times over the last 30 years. As that market became more competitive, they went into infrastructure, privatizing assets. Then they went into raising money to buy infrastructure assets.
Yes.
And now they've kind of come full circle where their commodities and financial markets division, again, is their most profitable division.
It just keeps evolving.
It is. And I think so. It's kind of that competitive advantage. Why are you in that business? And I think for each of the things that I've been involved in subsequent, I've always really looked at that. A value system that even though they were really prepared to take risk, there were boundaries of that risk. And their integrity, in my view, has allowed them to survive through some really difficult times.
Yes.
They just did not tolerate people stepping outside the boundaries.
With regards to the time at Macquarie, when did you start getting access into that sort of investment banking theme?
So the lucky thing for me was that internal audit was a place where you kind of went around the bank and you went to each division or several of the divisions and you rotated through them looking at their controls. Fortunately for me, there weren't many controls in place at the time. So you always could create a long list of things they needed to improve on. The bullion division happened to be a place that really had fewer controls than other places.
Yes.
Instead of kind of trying to address them themselves, the division director at the time, Nick Curtis, who I went on in business with for many years, said, well, why don't you just join us and try and sort this out?
Is that right? And that's where it started, because then you got to learn all about the bullion side. But that's when you also was introduced to China. Is that right?
So I was working in the bullion division, really fascinated by how you could create these instruments that allowed you to pay more for gold in a year or two's time than it was today. And remember, in those days, Macquarie had a real franchise. They're the only group who was really prepared to do that.
Yes.
They were prepared to take on risk. They knew that all you had to do was prove up you had enough reserves in the ground, and they would bank you with their forwards overlaying that, and they would take that risk. And then they would work through many difficult situations as well. But it was the most profitable division in the bank. The benefit I had was that I'd actually seen the rest of the bank, as where most people come into just that division and work there.
Yeah.
So when Nick Curtis was hosting someone from China who wanted to understand how financial markets worked in Australia, he said, well, Jake, why don't you host this person, take him around and introduce him to the various division heads across the bank. So I did that for 2 weeks. And then he invited Nick and myself and a geologist who was working in the bullion division at the time to come to visit some facilities in China. And we went on our first 2-week trip to China in 1995. We were at Jinchuan Nickel in the Gobi Desert, flying a Russian plane. I think it was a Tupolev out there, 3 hours from Beijing. The side of the plane got so hot you couldn't sit next to it.
No way.
Then we flew in. We went to dinner, obviously a big banquet. The president of Jinchuan Nickel was wearing a Mao suit, and a camel's foot arrived as the dish they were serving us as dignitaries there. Literally a camel's foot I think it was boiled. It looked so disgusting, but I'm still trying to get over
Goodness,
it.
mate.
But with a lot of Maotai and Baiju and alcohol, everything seems to taste okay at the end of the evening.
Oh, gosh. So that visit was obviously instrumental in starting a next chapter, so to speak.
Yeah, so we got really, really interested. China is and was the world's largest gold producer. The average size of a mine in China was only 16,000 ounces of gold a year, so they were really little village enterprises, but many, many of them. And the interesting thing, which to Nick's credit, he really articulated very well, in a planned system, units of commodities are seen as units of production. In a market-based system, markets are prepared to pay what the value of that commodity is in the ground before it's extracted.
Yes.
So he kind of saw the arbitrage of, well, we could own the entire China mining industry. Anyone who knows Nick would know that he's very ambitious, and we'll talk a little bit about Lynas later, I think. But he thought this is amazing. Russia was privatizing all of their assets, and we thought we could own all of China's gold industry. Things didn't turn out quite as optimistic as we thought, but we had an incredible time. Remember, this was a time when China was changing. More people were riding bicycles than cars at the time.
You left Macquarie, and in 1995?
We set up a joint venture between Macquarie and the Chinese government. So the Chinese government was China National Non-Ferrous Metals Corporation, which basically administered, I don't think it owned, it administered all of China's non-ferrous industry. They had a very significant amount of control. And they knew at that time, and I think this is worth just lingering on a minute, they knew at that time that for them to really create the industrial revolution that they were about to go through, they were desperately short of raw materials. And they knew they were. So they were very interested in our capacity to potentially allow them access or give them access to companies that had those sort of raw materials. And that's what they saw the banking connection being useful for.
Right.
So their interest was really securing long-term raw materials and potentially owning them. But at that time, they had very little confidence in dealing with international groups. So the first deal we did, which I think gave us access to our mining activity in China, because they weren't that interested in our mining in China, we did a deal with Alcoa, where Paul O'Neill, who was the Treasury Secretary, ultimately became the Treasury Secretary of the United States. He was the CEO of Alcoa, and he recognized at that time, this was in 1995, how significant China was going to be. And he basically gave them a sweetheart deal, a 30-year contract into Alcoa's alumina refining system at effectively cost with an upfront payment. Very similar to the deal we did at Ernest Henry with Glencore 30 years later. But that got us credibility with the Chinese government, who went, okay, these guys can potentially help us bridge into international organizations. And they allowed us to experiment on what I'd describe as a B-grade mine in the middle of China, Shaanxi province, where you had to fly to Beijing or Hong Kong, then get on a plane to Xi'an, catch an overnight train, a 3-hour ride on bumpy dirt roads in the middle of remote China, not a foreigner around. And to me, it speaks enormously to the capacity and entrepreneurship of the Australian mining industry, because we took a couple of Australian mining engineers, we walked over this hill after that 2-day journey, and we said, do you think you can build a mine here? And they said, sure.
At this point, though, you still weren't – had you decided that mining was going to be something you were going to pursue based on what you've just sort of learnt with your Chinese connections?
I don't think I ever made that decision. It just happened, because then we got really so excited about the opportunity. And I was 30 years old at the time. Going to China, remote parts of China, was just fascinating. China was starting to become more interesting to – I mentioned Alcoa, but all organizations started to want to understand China. So we were able to get access to institutions and groups who really weren't that interested in our gold mine, but were much more interested in understanding more about China. So it was really an incredible time. I mean, China was globalizing, it was opening, things were happening. As an example, the second mine we built, which was in Guizhou province, used to take us 9.5 hours to get there because you had to traverse through 2 very steep valleys. It was a drive, and that was from the capital city, 9 hours. By the time we left, it took 4 hours because the Chinese had built 2 bridges across those valleys. So we were really living through this incredible period of China.
And development. Well, you ended up doing 3 mines. You built 3 mines, and that really ultimately became Sino Gold.
Yeah, so
the company.
So, as a backstory, CNNC was actually dissolved by the government. So we woke up and we didn't have a shareholder. It took kind of 18 months for them to figure out where this renegade group should exist.
Right.
These foreigners who work for us, and we ended up in Minmetals. And Minmetals then allowed us to list the gold assets in 2002. So it was really during that whole period of somewhat chaotic change in China, but they were opening up.
And they allowed you to continue to build these mines to a point of where it became commercial, and it was obviously you became the largest foreign gold miner in China.
Yeah, we did. I think so. So I think this is where the genius of China really was, in that I think they understood that they needed to reform the industry, and they needed catalysts to reform the industry, but they were never going to give us access to their best assets.
Right.
And they always made certain that there was a significant joint venture partner in those joint ventures. And the joint venture partner, in hindsight, and these are a lot of things I've reflected on, were tasked with understanding as much as they possibly could about our activity and then embedding it into their organization, because they were a larger organization.
It was a total learning process.
It is a very clever learning process. And I'm not suggesting that we helped transform the mining industry, but I do understand from a number of my colleagues who I'm still in touch with that the safety standards which were introduced at our mines have now become part of the national safety standards.
Right.
So they did see it as an experiment, okay to give foreigners access to their B grade mines, never gave us access to the premier mines, and during that time have been phenomenally successful in reforming their industry and growing some of the most formidable and successful mining companies in the world.
Well, you ultimately were able to sell Sino Gold into Eldorado Group in late 2009 for $2.2 billion, which you think about that in the context of today's world, it's quite actually unbelievable.
It was. Again, China was regarded as opening.
Yes.
We were getting a lot of access. The ambassador for Australia came ambassador to China for Australia came to open our mines. Our profile was bigger than our company. But Xu Hanjing, who was our partner and who was the first person I took around Macquarie Bank, and he was our head of business development, he said things are changing in China and it's time to exit, and we sold.
Got it. It's interesting you say about China at that point. There, I read that when you were doing your negotiations or you're having meetings with your JV partners, the fog of cigarette smoke and the longevity of it, and it was just a very captivating time to be there, just to understand the way they were doing things.
It was amazing. I'm not sure we understood or recognized it at the time, but in hindsight, China has been incredibly successful strategically in reforming its industry, in growing these companies. There's an interesting story that Tommy McKeith, who's a high-profile director and geologist in Perth, he was working for Goldfields at the time, and he helped list Sino Gold. Goldfields owned 10% of the company,
right?
But at the same time he bought 10% of Zijin when Zijin listed, I think in 2005. that 10% that Goldfields owned in Zijin would be worth more than Goldfields is today.
Which is seriously saying something.
Well, Zijin, I think, is the third or fourth largest mining company in the world today.
And just that, which all goes towards that growth story that you're talking about. So when that finished up, well, you came back to working in Sydney, and then you started to look at opportunities, and that's where you became involved with Conquest Mining?
Yeah, so I was 45 and I thought too young to retire. And definitely looking for something easier to do than working in China, so closer to home. I was walking down Pitt Street one day, and a stockbroker, Richard Granger, who you may know.
Yeah, I know Grange.
He yelled across the road. He said, "Hey, Jake, I've got something to show you. Are you interested? Let's have a coffee." And he had Conquest as a client. Conquest had a failed feasibility study over Mount Carlton that had just been announced. Stock price was in the trash. It had $50 million, which was pretty good. And he said, "Are you interested in having a go at this?" And the interesting thing for me was that I immediately called the metallurgist who'd worked on our first mine, because we'd run out of money in China as well, and we'd actually been selling concentrate in China. And we thought, given that Mount Carlton is a refractory ore body, maybe it suited a sale of concentrate rather than trying to build the whole thing in Queensland. And that's what happened. We were able to cut the capital cost enormously of building it, change it from being a very sub-economic project, which was going to be on the shelf for a long time, into something that was economic and made us a lot of money and was a starter asset in Conquest.
That flowed on to merging with Catalpa Resources.
Yep.
And then the merged entity plus acquisition of Newcrest, Krakow and the Mountain Rawdon gold mines was the start of evolution.
Yeah, so I just want to go back a step, because when I got involved in Conquest, it was always with a view that there seemed to be a dearth of mid-cap gold miners in Australia. They'd all been bought up.
Right.
I think 75% of Australia's gold production at the time was owned by foreigners, because at that time, again, we're going back to 2010.
Yes.
Between 2000 and 2010, Australia was regarded as a place where you had to have a strategic position if you wanted to be a global mining company. So Barrick, Newmont, all of the groups,
the majors
had a big footprint in Australia. By 2011, they were all kind of thinking, we're not so sure about Australia. We'd rather be in more geologically prospective places like Africa. I think a terrible decision, but let's just leave it at that.
Yes.
And they started divesting of some of their assets. So it was always with a view that we were going to build a mid-tier gold company. It was not that we're going to build Mount Carlton and just try and pay some dividends to shareholders. So it was a frenetic activity, time of activity. We got involved in in Conquest. We got a contract for offtake for the Mount Carlton concentrate in China, with one of my colleagues who's actually still at Evolution today.
Right.
He went off with 6 buckets of concentrate and came back with the contracts to smelter. We did a hostile takeover of Pajingo. That was just as Conquest. Then Greg Robinson, who was the CEO of Newcrest at the time, had just bought Lihir, and we thought, well, Mount Rawdon and Krakow can't be core to that new strategy of Newcrest. So off we went to go and see Greg, who said, we've tried to sell Krakow once before, and this group, Catalpa, wouldn't let it go through because they got some sort of a preemptive. So if you go do a deal with Catalpa, we'll sell you Mount Rawdon and our 70% of Krakow. So we came here to WA, met with the team from Catalpa, and we put this 3-way deal together, which Newcrest owned 33% of. They owned 33% of Evolution to start.
So really, when you started Evolution, if I go back a step, this was really going to take advantage of your skill set within mergers and acquisitions, understand what good assets you could put together and build a company that way. I was quite interested to see and I I want to reference a speech you gave at the Melbourne Mining Club back in October 2016, where you were looking at the key characteristics that enduring, sustainable gold companies have, the ones that have been successful over the long term. And you cited companies like African Focus Rand Gold and Canada's Agnico Eagle. Going back in a bit of time here, Jake, but you know, the 5 points that you went through at this point, and so we're talking 2016, so Evolution was about 5 years old at that point. But firstly, they have efficient, high-quality assets that operate at a low cost. They all have at least one cornerstone asset that anchors the company with a long mine life and lowest quartile costs. Secondly, they consistently discover more ounces at their operations and at a minimum replace mining depletion, but often extend their already long mine lives. Thirdly, they consistently demonstrate financial discipline and have a strong, uncomplicated balance sheet. Fourthly, they all seem to demonstrate resilience founded on the core people culture of belief and understanding of their company's purpose. And then the final bit, and very importantly, they invest smartly. The holy grail of the resources industry is getting ourselves to the point where we are investing more on a counter-cyclical basis and returning more to investors on the upcycle. I thought that was fantastic because it looks at the way your psyche worked in the way that you looked at it. Evolution. And if I was to go back into 2011, and you've clearly outlined the way that it started, was that the purpose from the very beginning, or you're learning a bit along the way?
I'm still learning today. So I think it's a fascinating industry, but we have no control over the gold price. At the moment, the gold price is really high, but it's cyclical. So in a cyclical business, you really do want to be buying things when there's a motivated seller and there's some stress, then you get a good deal.
Yeah.
Today, find me a distressed gold company and I'd love to buy it. But there just aren't any because if you're mining gold today, you should be making a lot of money.
Yes.
The second thing, and I want to go back to kind of Macquarie and some of the things I learned there. What is going to be your core strategic advantage? The geology is obviously the biggest call you're going to make because, as a number of good friends, Jim Askew has told me, you can drill as many holes as you like into a deposit that doesn't have gold, and you won't find the gold.
Yeah. Right.
So again, part of our thesis was, who really puts themselves in the best positions? The majors do. They do a lot of work, and they generally put themselves in the best geological positions. If you've got good geology, you want to be good operators, but you can't be a good operator without good geology. So the geology is absolutely fundamental. Then you need to become a good operator, and I think the way you can become a good operator is by getting great people, making them act like owners, and again, a bit like Macquarie, like kind of making them feel part of the business. And that takes me, I suppose, to my last point on this, that I am not convinced that the gold companies are scalable. I think there's a right size. I've said up to 8 assets.
Yes.
I've said, why is that? You always want to be improving the quality of your assets, and you want to be divesting of the things divesting of something can also improve the quality of your asset base. People always seem to default to buying things as improving the quality, but actually selling your worst asset improves the quality of the rest of your portfolio. I think you need a portfolio. I think single mine companies don't really work because mines are not predictable as much as management try and tell you they are. There's volatility in the ore body, and they're not that predictable. So if you get a small portfolio, highly concentrated, you're going to get a lot less volatile outcome, and you're probably going to be able to deliver to expectations of shareholders. If you go above a certain size, and I'm pleased I mentioned Randgold because I really do think they were an amazing company.
Yes.
Mark Bristow positioned himself in Mali at a time when that was pioneering. Incredible geology, difficult jurisdiction to operate in, but because he was so focused on it, was able to succeed there. Fast forward, he vended Randgold into Barrick with a view, and I hope he's not listening to this because he may kill me if he is, with a view that he could turn Barrick into Randgold and have that core culture.
Right.
And I would say today, Randgold is more like Barrick than Barrick is like Randgold. And Barrick hasn't had a great few years. It's struggled to scale. I think it's got 20 plus assets.
Yes.
And I just don't think scaling a mining company works well. There's no real synergy between an asset in Kalgoorlie to one in Chile.
Well, when you look at the way you've evolved with Evolution, you've picked up assets along the way. So Carroll, Ernst Henry, Mount Rawdon, Macquarie and Red Lake, and an 80% share in North Parks. But just when you talk about what Barrick and Randgold have done, you're sitting here, if you're saying 8's optimal, you're sort of not quite there at 8, but,
No, we're not.
No.
But eight is just a number that I made up as like enough that one management team can probably remember all the names of the mines.
Yes.
And get access to. I'm a big believer that you need a culture where people really feel part of the company, where they feel empowered. And again, a little bit like Macquarie has got this very diverse business, but they've allowed people to become phenomenally successful within each of the different divisions and be empowered. If you can do that in a mining company, that's incredible.
Yes.
So our graduate program, as an example, is something I'm very proud of. We've been doing it for 10 years. So some of the graduates have been with us for 10 years, and some of them are running some of our biggest areas in the company. As companies seem to get bigger, there's more process, there's more control, and I feel you kind of become a number rather than an individual.
Yes. And
so how do you get sufficient size that your access to capital is the cost of capital is low. You can make enough money to invest in your asset base and acquire things. I kind of said, 8 assets is probably the right number.
Do you ever think about it in terms of production guidance? Do you have, obviously you're thinking along the lines of, well, for this year, you're going to be doing, well, it's stated 710,000 to 780,000 ounces. But from those current assets. But did you if you acquire another couple, do you want to get up to the 1 million ounces mark?
No, I have no production target. I think a production target and mining companies, gold companies, and we have a production guidance. Yes. I think we're wrong in talking about the top line.
Yep.
When Woolworths and Coles and companies put out their release, they don't talk about revenue, and yet gold companies talk about the number of ounces they're producing in the revenue line item. I think it's skewed investors' understanding of the industry, and the mining industry is to blame for it. We seem to talk about the top line too much and have these targets. I would rather produce less gold and make more money.
Yes.
By producing that gold at lower cost, then have a top line that shows you a growing number.
So when you're running these mines and the business as a whole, the all-in sustaining cost is the key figure.
The all-in sustaining cost, and I think it's got a bit blurred between all-in sustaining cost and growth capital. I think you've got to look at it on, what is the mine life really? What is it going to really cost you to sustain the business? But remember, all-in sustaining cost only really refers to sustaining to the current reserve base. So as you convert additional resources into reserves, you really are adding capital.
Yes.
But you don't have to spend money on acquiring those ounces. So organic growth is always the best.
Yep.
It is cheaper. And if you can put yourself in good geological positions, you take an asset like Carroll, which we bought in 2015. It was more than our market cap when we bought it from Barrick. It was due to close in 2024. I think we paid $550 million US.
Yes.
Today in 2025, it's repaid all of that $550 million. It's now got a production base. It's got an underground mine as well as the open pits. Produces over 300,000 ounces. Got a mine life out to 2042 at least. and it's generating a heap of cash. So that's the type of return that you want on assets. And I would encourage, Evolution. I'd encourage everyone in the sector to be much more focused on return on capital and bottom line. Like, what is your earnings? How long is your mine life?
Yes.
Rather than just this is the number of ounces we produced.
It's interesting with each one of your assets, the key is extending mine life. I mean, Ernest Henry seems like the golden goose, so to speak. Amazing asset. Mine life's out to 2040 as copper and gold. But it's quite drilling continues to deliver.
Yeah. So again, that was kind of an asset where Glencore at the time, 2016, were in a bit of trouble.
Yes.
They had a financial distressed situation. I think Ivan Glasenberg gave instruction to everyone to say, sell some, raise some money, but we don't want to sell copper units of production. So we used that playbook that actually I learned in with Sino Gold and Sino Mining International that we did with Alcoa. We'll pay them an upfront payment. We'll take all of their gold and 30% of their copper, and we gave them $880 million up front. And that was our entry. We called it an economic interest into Ernest Henry.
Yes.
Ivan was able to get 880 million Aussie dollars, hadn't sold 70% of the copper, had given us access to the gold, but great deal for them and great deal for us. And that then made the asset subscale to them.
Yes.
Because they didn't own all of the gold, any of the gold, and they only owned 70% of the copper. So their willingness to invest in exploration was very limited. And so the mine was due to close in 2026. We bought the rest out in 2021, and the rest is history. We've drilled it. It'll go out to at least 2040, probably longer, and it's just been a phenomenal asset. But that's a distressed situation. A high quality asset, really good geology, quite similar to Cal.
Just going back to Rule 5, that was buying in counter-cyclical times. 2016 was one of those.
Yeah, the checkbook's away right at the moment.
Yeah, sure. Mount Rawdon, a fantastic story. 85 kilometres west of Bundaberg. That just continues to give, but it's turning into an amazing asset in itself, pumped hydro project. Yeah,
well, Tim, we should reference your father-in-law over here because you said it's David Mueller, 1979, walking around the bush in 85 kilometres of west of Bundaberg. He must have been lost.
I'll ask him that.
To his credit, he found and discovered Mount Rawdon. I think it took 1979. I think it was finally put into production in 2001.
So 20 odd years.
Yeah. Nick Georgetta in Samantha Gold put it into production, and it's just a classic story of Australian gold mining. Something that we should all be proud of. It should be written up, and people should be celebrated because they still how David found it is a mystery. All of these discoveries are quite amazing. They require an enormous amount of courage. How Nick built it, there's still people at Mount Rawdon who were working there 25 years ago who talk about the fact that he built it for $30 or $35 million.
Yes.
He watched every pour of concrete into the foundations. And the mine, very low-grade mine, it really has been made successful because the people of Mount Perry have benefited so much and they've wanted to work there. So it's all a local workforce. There were very, very few fly-in, fly-out people at Mount Rawdon. It really has. I think if you Google Mount Rawdon, I think it comes up as the lowest grade gold mine in the world, open pit, now. And it was, I think, 0.5 or 0.6 of a gram when we were mining it towards the end.
Yeah.
And it's just incredible. It had an 8-year mine life in 2001. We finished mining in 2025, and we processed some low-grade stockpiles. But then about 5 years ago, someone came to us and said, this is ICA Partners, who energy experts, said, we've done a review of all of Australia. We think this clean energy is going to be the next thing. Pumped hydro is really important. We've done a study of all of Australia, and Mount Rawdon's characteristic suit pumped hydro, and we want to do a deal with you on turning Mount Rawdon into pumped hydro. To be honest, at the time, I thought this is a really amazing way to close this mine.
Yes.
I hadn't learned anything about pumped hydro. I didn't know what it was. But over the years, I've become fascinated by it. I've become intrigued by it. I think it's an amazing energy storage system. It's going to be absolutely necessary for Australia's energy transition. And Mount Rawdon today is the most advanced, definitely the lowest cost pumped hydro opportunity. It could generate up to 2 gigawatts of power, which would power 2 million homes in Brisbane.
Which is phenomenal for the Queensland community.
Yeah, so the Treasurer of Queensland recently announced that they're putting $50 million into it via their subsidiary or government entity, Klein, and we're working with them. I think this would just be such an incredible story for the mining industry,
yes,
for the Bundaberg region, for Queensland, and it will really demonstrate mining's contribution to our economy, clean energy, and frankly, the lives of Australians.
It's become a real project of yours personally. You're really getting behind it.
It has. It just fascinates me. I think Australia's on the road to trying to develop a clean energy grid.
Yeah.
I think there's, if you go back to, again, what is the arbitrage or what's the opportunity? I think energy is enormously important. It's definitely in our national interest to have clean energy. It's in our national interest as a resource sector to have cheap, clean energy. And right at the moment, I don't think you have a roadmap to deliver that.
No.
You have a federal government targets and strategy. You have a state governments who are responsible for actually implementing those targets. You have no real understanding as to how much this is all going to cost or what the energy mix should even be.
Yes, it's complex.
It's complex, but you have people who are talking about it, and the most recent election is a good example where we have ideological differences not based on fact.
Yes.
So my view would be, if we all agree it's in our national interests, let's get some experts to write the script and really determine what is the most efficient, best way, optimal way of getting to clean energy. Put aside all these targets that have been announced. Let's just agree, what should Australia do to get to a clean energy target which the population wants?
It gets behind, yeah.
And don't have state interests, federal interests, Liberal Party interests, Labor Party interests. Let's just really get some experts. And then, I think we'll get a much better outcome than we're currently going to get.
Yes, but it's getting to that point, Jake, is the tough part.
Well, I think that's one of the real challenges of Australia at the moment. We have very partisan views on important issues. We can't seem to agree on anything. And the recent election is probably a great example of that. I have yet to meet someone who's been inspired or motivated, whatever their side of politics was, by the election campaign, because everything was just about short-term issues.
Well, we'll get to the short-term versus long-term thinking in a moment. But I must say, going back to Mount Rawdon, a shout out to Nick Georgetta and David Mueller, and I'm sure they'll one day look at this in its current existence, and it's a hats off to evolution in terms of a pumped hydro scheme that's leading Australia in terms of what it can contribute to the energy supplies of Queensland is a result that no one would have expected back in those days.
I think they deserve all the credit. I always joke that Mount Rawdon is the gold asset with the shortest mine life, but it will be around operating in 100 years' time.
You've got some other assets which are worth, we talked about Cal, North Parks, 30-year mine life. Cal's it's been extended out to 2040 as well. Cal's out at West Wyalong. That's true blue farming country out there, and mining country, of course, with this.
It is. It's another one that took kind of 20 years to get permitted because there is a bund wall
Right.
that separates Lake Cowal from the mine. But again, if you go to the local community today, because we've just extended the mine life and we've got all the permits and everything in place, it had huge local community support for the extension of the bund wall and everything that was so controversial in its early days. So Australia can be very proud of the way it mines, the way it looks after the environment whilst it mines, and the impact of mining is much less than people have in their heads.
Yes.
Other than the great economic impacts.
Yes. The only other couple I wanted to the Coolgardie operation, Macquarie.
Yep.
And then you've got Red Lake. But if we just talk about being in the goldfields, I mean, clearly a tier one jurisdiction, as you like to say.
Definitely tier one.
Yeah.
Little difficult, more difficult. It's taken us time to consolidate the ground position. So that was done in 3 phases, really. We bought Frog's Leg and Whitefoil with La Mancha when they actually helped fund us into Cal. Naguib Sawiry is a billionaire, vended La Mancha into Evolution.
He's an Egyptian.
That's right, Egyptian billionaire.
Yeah.
But he agreed, in addition to vending his assets in, to underwrite $100 million US of equity for our next acquisition, which was the only way we could actually afford to bid $550 million US for Cal, because it was more than our market cap at the time.
Goodness me. It's not a bad shareholder to have.
He is excellent. He is great. Except when, as a director of the company, he came to the annual general meeting, and as chair, I said, "Are there any questions?" And he put up his hand. He said, "Yeah, I'd like to ask a question." But he was great. Anyway, then we bought we bought Phoenix, which is the ground north of the Kundana ground, which was owned by Northern Star, and that's been an important part of this new growth expansion, because it's got a lot of the open pits that we're going to be mining. And then in 2020, I think we bought, maybe it was 2019, we bought Kundana ground from Northern Star. So that's consolidated the whole district for us. And we've recently built an expanded plant to 4.2 million tonnes. We doubled the capacity of the plant. I think someone said it's the first thing that's been done in the goldfields that was done under budget and ahead of time.
Well, that flows into Red Lake, which was your only operation in Canada. Apart from the acquisition, doing business in Canada versus, clearly you've acquired businesses here in Australia. You've divested businesses and mines here in Australia. Canada, how does that rank alongside Australia?
It's definitely a tier one mining jurisdiction.
Yes.
There are definitely cultural differences.
Right.
So the analogy I give is, as a South African coming to Australia in 91, I couldn't believe how polite and respectful Australians were, and I don't think they could believe how rude and direct South Africans are. Probably still can't. I'd say as Australians going to Canada, we couldn't believe how polite and respectful Canadians were, and they couldn't believe how rude and direct Australians were. So you got the two bookends. I'm putting Canadians on the one side and South Africans on the other, and Australians in the middle. It's definitely a place that is more difficult to affect change than we expected. We probably came in with a lot of bravado and kind of said, we can change this. This is a mine that's been going for 50 years. And we thought we're buying it from Newmine. This is going to be exactly the same playbook as what we'd bought from Barrick, what we bought from Glencore. We're just going to turn this around and make it much better. And it's been much, much harder to affect the change that we wanted. We probably didn't listen as much as we should have. And we probably didn't respect the differences and really listen as much as we could have or should have.
So it's been a learning process.
There's a lot of scars on us as a result of it.
Yes, yes.
I don't want to let shareholders down. I'm using their money. At the end of the day, we are custodians of other people's money, and we should always act like that.
Yes.
And failure should be reflected on. It's not something I take lightly. We always want to be kind of humble about it, even our successes. But we want to recognize that we are not faultless and that we do make mistakes and that we've got to improve when we do them. The challenge, in the mining sector is that in order to do a deal, you have to take risk.
Yes.
So, we talked about, mid-sized companies and larger companies. The more committees and meetings and debate you have over whether you should do something, the more likely you are going to move back and not do it.
Yes.
So how do you get the right blend of culture? And I've described it as, you've got to walk out onto the edge of the ledge and then jump off. But there are a lot of people saying, well, you shouldn't do this, because of that. And the more people you ask and the more you debate it. So I always go back to, is this right on strategy? In Red Lake's case, we were buying it from a major. It was a tier 1 jurisdiction. The geology was a very, very well-endowed district. It ticked those boxes. There were certain things that we should have understood better, but we didn't. And then COVID broke out and we couldn't visit it for 18 months.
Yeah.
But fundamentally, you're not going to be able to do any of these deals or anything without jumping off the edge. And as long as it's on strategy and you stick to your values and you have integrity about it, I think you'll succeed.
We talk about shareholder value, Jake. Obviously, a privilege to speak to the founder of the company, but you've taken it from zero to a market cap now of $16 billion. There's been some serious shareholder value return, and you've paid dividends on consecutive years.
We have. I do think we should pause to recognise all the other people who've contributed. Laurie Conway's now the CEO. He's doing a fantastic job at running it. There have been people who've really put their heart and soul into running the business, and I always want to recognise and acknowledge the people who right now, for example, it's late at night in Canada,
yes,
who are working underground, operating, working on equipment, operating the mills. Likewise in Kalgoorlie here, we've got people working underground, we've got people working on surface. It's those people that ultimately, if you can inspire and motivate them, make the company great. Yes, we as a board and as an executive team make the decisions that ultimately put us into these assets or divest of those assets. But it's an effort of 3,000 people who need to be rowing in the same direction.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, it's and again, you've got to acknowledge that the gold price has also had a big impact on our share price.
Yes.
2 or 3 years ago, we were not doing that well. We weren't delivering as efficiently as we needed to, and we were in the dog box from an investor perspective. So yes, we got the gold price as a tailwind. We were operating really well, but we always need to recognize that there's certain things that we can't control. If the gold price went down $500 tomorrow, our share price would be down and we'd be doing the same thing.
Yes, yes. Your comment on people, it resonates through most of the information that I've read, that you really had designed a company where the people felt like they had a say, but you wanted them to be part of the company. It still obviously very much stands true.
Yeah, I've been well known to say that procedure and process gives me hives. So I'm not a very detailed person. I want people to feel empowered.
Yes.
Again, and then you need to recognize that empowerment if they succeed. And as long as they don't deviate from your values or test the integrity of the company or breach the integrity of the company, then I think you want to almost acknowledge and welcome errors, subject to you improving from them.
When you talk about people, though, you talked about it earlier, the graduate program, the succession planning within Evolution is on target. You're happy with the way it's sort of evolving?
I've always said I want people's time at Evolution to be the highlight of their career.
Yes.
Hopefully a long time. I think that we've had a number of people who say that and who've said that.
Yes.
If we can do that, where sometimes people may not have the opportunity to grow further in our business and they go somewhere else, but they always regard their time at Evolution to be fantastic, then and they'd come back. That's a good test. I think the industry does need to get better at retaining people, particularly on mine sites. I think our corporate office retention is good. I always go back. Western Australia's now we are retaining our people much better than we were a few years ago.
Yes.
Maybe the market was hotter. Maybe we weren't doing as well as a company. Maybe we weren't doing as well at Macquarie. But now there's a future at Macquarie that goes out 15 years. They're having success, and there seems to be a real momentum and desire to stay at Macquarie. But I think there's always places you can do better. I mean, at the end of the day, someone driving a truck today, how do you connect them to being and feeling part of Evolution?
Mm.
They don't really care what our share price is potentially, or that every person at Evolution is an owner of stock. We've given away, I think, $1,000 of stock to everyone across the company for the last 7 years.
Right.
So we have tried to make people owners, but it is just a case of how do you connect that truck driver, that jumbo operator, that person sitting in people and culture out at Macquarie or Red Lake to feeling part of the company. And I think companies grow to a point where it's difficult to do that.
Yes, yes. And that's as you say, that's an industry challenge rather than just an Evolution challenge.
It is, and that's why I'm a believer that a company shouldn't grow to the point where it doesn't feel personal.
Yeah.
And when you speak to people who are part of larger organizations, that tends to be how they feel. They're a number.
Yeah.
We sometimes asked to get a meeting with one of the bigger resource companies, and it kind of takes them 2 weeks to figure out who's coming to the meeting. That doesn't seem like a nimble, agile organization.
Wouldn't appear so, no. If we could just move forward in terms of congruent to your role at Evolution, you had a couple of non-executive roles. One of them was with China Gold and the other with Lynas Rare Earths, which you referred back to Nick Curtis earlier.
Yes.
Yeah, be interested in your views on observations on Lynas Rare Earths and
So Nick is one of the finest entrepreneurs in Australia.
And you both came out of the Macquarie stable.
Yes. He was well ahead of me when we were at Macquarie, but he's an amazing entrepreneur, deep thinker. He identified, I think he found some saying by Deng Xiaoping that, we don't have oil, but we have rare earths. This is in the 1970s from Deng Xiaoping. So right at that point, China recognized the relevance and importance of rare earths, and Nick came across Mount Weld in Lynas, which did have a small gold mine, Lynas Fines, at the time, and he decided that was strategically so important to China, so rare earths are going to be really, really important, and he dived into the use of rare earths, and Mount Weld happens to be, or it was, the richest rare earths deposit in the world. And he started off building Lynas. And
he got you involved?
He did.
Back in 2005.
Yeah, and it was fascinating. He was right in articulating the usage of rare earths. You've got Donald Trump talking about rare earth deals now.
Yes.
And Nick was talking about it in 2005. There were a few misses that we made along the way. The fact that the plant was ultimately built in Malaysia. I suppose we couldn't afford to build it in Australia, and Malaysia was very welcoming at the time. It created a whole lot of community issues in Malaysia, which we didn't understand when we went and embarked in building the plant there. But that plant, I think, should have been built in Australia. Had the Australian government and had the US government had the strategic direction that these metals were really going to be important, they would have supported the development of that operation in Australia, wholly in Australia.
Just on that though, as a case in point or as an example, is it too late for the processing to be done in Australia if the government got behind it?
So the Lynas had to basically rebuild part of the plant in Kalgoorlie because of those community concerns. So they've spent $500 million or thereabouts building the kilns in Malaysia.
Yes.
But they still take the products to Malaysia to separate into these rare earths, and then they're building something in the US that separates it further. I think it is a missed opportunity in Australia. I know that there's concern around the cost of it, the competitiveness of it.
Yes.
And there's a lot of IP.
Yes.
But if we allied with the United States, and the United States really wants to build a supply chain that is independent of China for these critical minerals.
And reliable.
Then shouldn't they be putting their money together with the Australian government, that we form alliances with allies and put these plants in the place where they're best suited?
Yes.
Now, one of the caveats I'd say is that, a precondition to having industrial capacity and plants like that is cheap energy. So it's something Australia really needs to solve, cheap and clean energy.
Just generally, Jake, and you've started to touch on it now, but China and the general state of the industry, should I say. I went back over some of your earlier speeches, and you mentioned earlier the Sydney Mining Club address in 2021. You did a WA Mining Club presentation in October 24, and then you'd done a recent opinion article for the Australian newspaper in April 25. The one in 21, there's just this quote that came out. It just stuck with me. Since Deng Xiaoping started to open up China's economy in 1978, it has grown at a phenomenal 10% per annum. 850 million people have been lifted out of poverty, and today China is the world's second largest economy. It is projected that by 2028, only 7 years from now, from the date of that address, China will become the biggest economy in the world. Your experience there is justifying that over and over in terms of the rate of development and how fast they're moving. Globalisation was a key point in the October 24 address, where you've stated effectively that globalisation is essentially over. The world has effectively decoupled. And you expressed how sad you were with that outcome, but that really, when you're looking at China now, we are now effectively in long-term strategic competition with China, a country that has been the biggest driver of our economic prosperity over the last 30 years. If we go to 2025, it was a great article you wrote, by the way, for The Australian, and detailed, but talking about the growth in iron ore exports. It's increased 35 times since the early 1990s. The amount of tax, the windfall for the federal government at $365 billion, and the surge of national income from mining booms that has underpinned our housing and superannuation wealth. We then talk about China in the last 30 years. Today, Chinese companies control 70% of the copper production in the Democratic Republic of Congo, widely regarded as one of the best copper belts on the planet. In Guinea, Chinese companies are dominating the construction of Simandou, which is recognised as the world's highest quality undeveloped iron ore. Last year, Indonesia all but killed off Australia's nickel sector. With strong government support, Indonesia successfully harnessed Chinese capital and innovation and combined it with cheap labour and power to become the dominant force in global nickel. There's a lot to unpack there, but you've written about this and you've obviously got a view on it. How are you feeling about it now?
I feel very concerned.
Yeah.
I think China is much more ready for this phase than we are. And I think we're underprepared, and we should recognize that this is a moment in history that will define our future. I used the Kodak moment in that talk. Obviously, Kodak, a company that ended up in bankruptcy, but you can imagine being around the boardroom at Kodak when the digital cameras came out, and obviously people said no, that's not. People love Kodak; they're not going to go for digital.
I remember it.
My new analogy, and I think it's probably better, is you would have heard about the experiment. If you put a frog in cold water and you heat the water up slowly, the frog never jumps out and eventually boils in the water.
Yes.
That's how I think Australia is. That over the last 30 years, the temperature has been rising, and we've become so dependent on China that we haven't really recognized that China has been growing its own strategy over that whole 30 years that could result in us being more vulnerable than we've ever been before. And we cannot, I really am quite passionate about this, we cannot expect that if we do the same as we did over the last 30 years, we will be as successful in the next 30 years.
Yes.
And if you look at some of the markers around it, you know, we have a high labor cost, and I think that's fine. We have high energy costs, which I don't think is fine. We have reduced our expenditure on education. There are fewer positions in universities for mining-related jobs than there was a decade ago. We have to get better at productivity. If you've got high wages and you've got high cost of energy, you need to get better at productivity.
Yes.
And that's going to require technology. And again, if you think about the conversations during the election, I didn't really hear one politician talk about the need for technological innovation in Australia in the mining sector.
Yes.
And I think it's a sector that is ready for disruption. But if we want to be competitive and we want to compete with this growing China and their presence in Indonesia, where they've got cheap labor, cheap cost of power, and Chinese technology, or in Africa, again, cheap labor, cheapish power, geologically even more, evolving terrain, because Australia's terrain is quite mature, Australia's geology. So the next discoveries we're going to make, and there are lots of discoveries to be made in Australia, but they're going to be deeper and more expensive to develop and mine.
Yes.
So we need to recognize that. And then we need to create, in my view, a strategy and a commitment that allows us to invest in education, in technology, and really motivates our nation to go to the next level.
How do you get that alignment of, for example, I know the alignment of federal and state government policy as one potential format, but it's so difficult to get that alignment. The technology is another classic. It's quite interesting where we're seeing autonomous trucks, driverless trucks, they're going to go electric. We're seeing electric drill rigs coming to the fore. That it's happening. Technology is coming our way. But embracing it from an Australian perspective is the challenge.
But I think we should be making ourselves the centre of technological innovation for the mining industry.
Yes.
Just like I think we should be making ourselves the centre for capital raising for the mining industry globally, so that Canadian, South American companies use the Australian stock exchange to raise their capital.
Yes.
Again, we're the country in the world that is probably most dependent on mining relative to other countries. We have a huge amount of knowledge in the industry, bankers, lawyers who understand the industry, stockbrokers, euros.
Yes.
We are better than other countries in this. And my view is, Americans, you can go and see a fund manager in New York. Resources isn't that interesting to them. The Magnificent Seven is.
Yes.
So they're not that interested in resources. Listing Evolution in New York would do nothing. So let's try and make this the center of gravity for the capital markets, debt, equity, mezzanine capital. There's not one royalty company, or there's one royalty company listed on the Australian Stock Exchange, but we should be gravitating the royalty companies to come list in Australia as well.
Yes.
So I think there's a huge opportunity, but it requires a commitment and an alignment that says this is what we really want to be great at.
How do you think that alignment or that commitment comes about, though? Jake, you know, do you take the leaders of the most influential companies and bring them together to make a plan, or does it come from government, or does it come from the different bodies?
You know, you mentioned federal and state politics as an example. You know, are we at a time of maturity in our nation's history? We've got to rethink some of those things, how we do those things. So I think it requires commitment and endeavour on all levels. Yes, business leaders need to start talking about it, but politicians need to start thinking beyond election cycles as well. And then we need to find things that we can agree on. And I think we'd all agree that we want the next generation of Australians to be as prosperous as us. And I've had the unbelievable good fortune of living in this country through probably one of its best periods of economic development and success.
Yes.
And I'd love my children to have the same exposure. And at this point in time, unless we change what we're doing, I don't believe Australia will deliver that.
It's an interesting point you raise, Jake, around the short-term nature of Australian thinking versus, I know you've referred that back to China and how they have a long-term strategy. That is probably what you're driving at here.
Yeah, I think so. If I reflect back to the 90s when I first went to China, China was a socialist plan system. They've now evolved themselves into a market system. They're a capitalist market economy. So they're now right in the space of where we are. Now, I'm not suggesting that I would want to live in China, but they don't have elections and they don't have a free media. Again, I reiterate that this is not necessarily a model that we should follow.
No.
But it gives advantages given that they're competing in the market economy space, that if you have a short-term election cycle and everyone is working towards an election cycle of 3.5 years and trying to get their view across, and we have all this flip-flopping all the time, you're probably going to come off worse than the group than China.
Yes. Just moving forward, I know that, you know, one of the other things that you're pretty passionate about is showcasing all the great things that mining does. And that probably forms part of this whole push to make sure we elevate for the future. When you see mining and you do the global travel that you do, you know, how do we elevate mining? I mean, your case in point with regards to the Magnificent Seven, say, for example, in the US versus the mining companies. Well, they've had a lot more growth, yet mining provides the resource that enables it.
Yeah, we may never win everyone over, but certainly in Australia there's an opportunity to win the vast majority of people over.
Yes.
And then we could sell that story and articulate it better. But, you know, where's the advert on television about all the components that your Apple or Samsung phone has that was made in a mine? We should be telling the story better, and that's incumbent on all of us.
Yes. Well, 12th of February 2025, there was an announcement made that you were going to transition from executive chairman to non-executive chair. That's a change from your perspective?
Yeah, I think it's the right thing for Evolution. It's something we've been planning for 2 years, and you know the company has evolved. It's now a bigger company. It requires more process, not too much, but more.
Yep.
It's got some fabulous assets, and I'm really proud of what we've achieved. But I kind of spent 15 years on my journey in China. It's been about 15 years with Evolution, and I think the team is ready to take over.
Yes.
So I'll be an interested non-executive chair, probably too interested for Laurie's liking. I will certainly continue to be a shareholder. And I just love the company. I love the people in the company because it was easier to exit the entire company. It would have been easier, but I really love the people in the company. So, I've decided to stay as non-executive chair. And the next chapter is yet to be written, but probably too young, or maybe not too young, but feel too young to go sit at home and meet mates for cups of coffee every morning. So, next chapter is yet to be written, but there'll be something.
Well, fantastic. I mean, it's great to be able to do that on your own terms and after such a distinguished career. Clearly, Laurie is an integral part of that.
He is, and he's doing great. And again, it's been a great journey for him. He joined as a non-executive director for Newcrest,
right?
When we formed Evolution, and him and Pete Smith. Pete Smith is still a director. He left for a while, but he came back. So they were nominated as the directors, and I think they really thought, like, what has Newcrest done? This is a crazy company. And then 4 years later, I managed to convince Laurie that actually the crazy company was Newcrest and he should come and join Evolution. And he did, and he's been fantastic. He's been an integral part of our success as the CFO and for the last couple of years as CEO, and he'll do a fantastic job going forward.
Oh, that's good. So what else do you do outside of mining and running Evolution? Do you get down to Bondi?
I do. I exercise a lot. It's been one of the things that I've been a bit fanatical about. My kids call me orthorexic, which I'm still got to look up in the dictionary, but I think it's addicted to exercise.
Yes.
And it's the one thing that I've been able to do that really clears my mind. And so a day always starts with some exercise. Running, although I'm getting a little creaky for running too much. So Pilates now. I do Pilates 3 times a week. That seems to be keeping me together. Good for the bones. I've tried to start surfing again a little bit. This is 35 years after I surfed a lot as a kid.
Yes.
I got out the water the other day. I thought I was ripping it away in these big waves, and my wife said, "Oh, there are no waves. What happened?" So yeah, very active, still capable of enjoying myself and loving I love work and I love the mining industry. They're fascinating characters. They're the people make this industry.
Yeah.
And the highs are high and the lows are low. It's very cyclical, but you're definitely not selling widgets.
No. Look, I'm conscious of time, but I had to ask you before you go, and I know you'll be able to answer this one diplomatically, but what's your view on the gold price?
You can never ask a gold miner what their view on the gold price is because it's obviously positive. But
back self-interest?
Yeah. What I would say is that gold is a good barometer of where the world is.
Yes.
And the world's at a pretty ordinary place.
Yes.
And if you think that over the next 3.5 years of Trump's presidency, it's going to get to a better place, then you should probably sell gold. But I'd say that's unlikely.
Right. Well, we've got that answer. That's fantastic. Look, Jake, I must say it's been a fantastic chat. And in all seriousness, to get off the plane, come straight here, over from Sydney, is just a fantastic effort. You did highlight it then, but you can just so tell with your body language and the way you describe it that you do love what you do. You love the mining industry. You love the people in it. And I can just tell that you're so proud of some of the achievements that not only you but the team have done over so many years. And the colourful stories and understanding of what you've done throughout China and understanding where that country has come from when you first started going there, and it's just been so insightful. Evolution from founding up to a 16 billion market cap really does say something. Good luck with the next stage. And on behalf of all of us at Euroz Hartleys, thanks a lot for taking the time. We've really been on Finding the Front. We really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Tim. It's been great.
Good on you. Thanks, mate.
Cheers.
Thanks for listening to Euroz Hartleys Finding the Front. This podcast is for general information purposes only. Please check out eurozhartleys.com for more information. Euroz Hartleys holds Australian Financial Services Licence 230052.